Colleagues, this is quite a very important workshop, in that this is where our research at the end of the day will start, because without the ethics, a student won't be able to graduate. The students should know that before they go anywhere else with their research, they should be able to make sure that they apply for ethics. We have been having problems where students have already been examined, and where they have examined their thesis or dissertation. Now they want to seek for ethics. Ethics cannot be done retrospective. What I mean is, you cannot ask for an ethics application when you have got already graduated to say, I'm asking for ethics application from 2019 to from 2018 to 2019. It doesn't happen that way. Ethics is asked before you do that thing, because literally whatever data you would have gathered, it's useless if that data was not collected after you have been given the ethics approval. So the purpose of this workshop is we want to make you students aware of the ethics process in the university, with some emphasis on College of Science, Engineering and Technology. But we are going to cover the whole university system. That's why we've got our expert, Dr. Visagie. Now you find that she's going to go through a lot of things, which includes the guidelines and policies in the research. And also nowadays you find that due to the COVID-19, there's now a COVID-19 policies and guidelines which are available, which you should know, because you know about distancing at the end of the day, so that it's those people who wants to do face-to-face interview. Either what you are going to do is you are going to use online survey, or you are going to do telephone survey and the like. So you should really know the position of Unisa in terms of the COVID. You find that we've got a limited amount of time. As you can see, we've got only up to 1 o'clock. She might not finish everything, but she'll give you a guideline of whatever is there. And some of these policies are on your website, which you can get, and you find that for each college there we have got this ethics under website pertained to that college, which you can go where there your research for application forms, and also you see all these guidelines. You should read these policies because they are very important. And then Dr. Visagie is also going to go through the Form 1, which is the most important, in that it is where you use human interaction. And because of human interaction, there's a lot of ethical consideration which you take if you are using humans in your interaction, and the way you should do in these days of COVID-19. We are also going to briefly touch Form 2 and Form 3. Form 2 is for secondary data, and then Form 3, it is when you are going to do your research without necessarily use of secondary data or face-to-face interaction. So without further ado, I'm going to leave it to Dr. Visagie to go through this workshop in terms of the research ethics review. Some of us will be coming in here and there, Tanya, myself, and Tony, as we go on. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Visagie.
Hello and welcome to my right hand and my left hand, and that is Tanya Kutsia. She's responsible for coordinating all the training in our office with our other young colleague, Tandu, that cannot be with us today. But colleagues, I would have loved to have a more interactive conversation with you. Unfortunately, due to the load shedding, I'm now working on one screen, and I can actually only see my own presentation. So I want to ask Tanya and Tony to really take the freedom to stop me if you see there are some comments in the chats and there are some urgent questions. Please stop me, and so that I can address those questions. But let me then continue and share with you just some of our objectives that Ms. Suisa already set out, but I think what is very important in the space of research ethics is, first of all, that for you to apply for research ethics or to supervise a student throughout the research ethics journey, it's critical that you actually understand certain documents and principles that act as benchmarks for completing the relevant forms, as well as for reviewing ethics applications. And Tanya had assisted me to compile some resources that I think you might be find very helpful. And one of these resources is actually the Department of Health Guideline 2015. And colleagues, you might think that, but you know what, I may be a student in computing sciences and I don't do health research, but I think you may find the health guidelines quite helpful. For instance, if you want to do research with minors, for instance, it provides you with very good guidance. Also in terms of informed consent, or even if you are not 100% sure how to apply the Protection of Personal Information Act within the space of your own research project. The Department of Health guidelines offer actually very good structure in that regard. We are also going to have a conversation about your responsibilities as a researcher, but also the role of a supervisor and then the role of research ethics committees within the context of Unisa. And then the last part of this engagement will focus on how can we now apply the principles, the benchmarks, policy stipulations, as well as the standard operating procedure on risk assessment and also the COVID-19 guidelines on the research that you are currently planning or that you are in the process of executing. This research ethics review framework is quite a handy tool. I think if you focus on maybe remembering this framework, it will really guide you in terms of addressing certain of the concerns that you might have when you apply for research ethics. So first of all, for you to apply for research ethics or to then supervise a student throughout this process, you really need to understand the principles and the convictions that underlie moral reasoning. Many of the issues relating to research ethics are actually linked to certain moral decision making or your ability to reason about specific things. If we, for instance, think about an example, say for instance, you are doing research and you are doing that in the context of a prison. And in that context, you have never communicated with your participants that you will also involve a transcriber, for instance. But now you have actually collected maybe a lot of data. Let's say that you have collected 100 hours of data, and now you actually realize that you will not be able to transcribe all that data yourself. So your question would now be, can I just get a transcriber to assist me with transcribing the 100 hours of data that I have? And colleagues, obviously this will demand that you actually think about certain things. So it will mean that you have to think about the principles and the rights of your participants. If you think about the participants in the present context, we know that they are also a vulnerable group. In one of our previous workshops, we even identified them as having double vulnerability. They're not only vulnerable because they are in a prison and their freedom has been negatively influenced. They don't actually have personal freedom the way we have it, but they may also have childhood trauma. They may have socioeconomic challenges. So all of those aspects result in them actually being vulnerable. And the question will now be, can you actually go ahead and share their personal information that they shared with you in a secret space, so to speak, because in a way you have committed to them that only you and maybe your supervisor will have access to this information. So can you now actually then just send this information and obtain the services of a third person? So you will see that this will demand from you to really think about the principles. And the principle that you will have to consider here would, for instance, then be autonomy. Autonomy referring to the fact that they must have self-determination. Initially, they signed informed consent. You have not discussed it with them in the context of them giving you consent to interview them, to use this information. You will now have to think about harm. Say, for instance, this is a topic that is very sensitive. Who can be harmed by getting maybe exposed to this information? Say, for instance, that the transcriber is a very sensitive person. May she not be harmed in a way if she's part of transcribing these interviews? So I'm sure that you will now understand that research ethics is never black and white. It's often grey. It's also sometimes very challenging the moment that you enter the field, because, you know, sitting at your desk and planning your research and writing your proposal and even completing the ethics application form, you are not confronted at that very point in time actually with the realities that you may face in the field. And those realities will demand from you that you can think on your feet, that you remain ethical, that you really understand the principles of research ethics. And I think what I find extremely concerning when I review research ethics applications, it is clear to me that the applicants actually do not read extensively to understand research ethics, potential harms linked to their studies. You would often get an application where it could be a sensitive topic, but then the applicant, for instance, would say there are no harms, and without even justifying why the person believed that this study does not yield any potential harm for the participants. So really, if you leave this session today and you can memorize or you can identify the ethical principles and you can apply those principles to your research, then I think we would have made a mark in your life. So then secondly, on this framework, you will see that you also need to then be aware of relevant policies, procedures, and definitely legal requirements. Research ethics is situated within your national space, and within the national space there are specific regulations and legislation applying to research ethics. For instance, the National Health Act is actually the act that provides us with guidance in terms of research ethics, but also then the Protection of Personal Information Act, as well as the PIA Act. If you want to obtain records, for instance, from a specific institution, you want to use that information, you will have to adhere to the stipulations and regulations set out in the PIA. So really understand your context and also understand the policies and the procedures and then the legal requirements. Because if you think about the example that I shared with you, in that context, you cannot just now change your approach and invite, for instance, a transcriber, a third party, and expose that third party to this information without now reconsenting the participants, for instance, without now informing both the Department of Correctional Services Ethics Review Committee of this amendment to your proposal, as well as the committee that granted you the approval at Unisa, for instance. Because if you don't do it, you are actually trespassing policy, and you could even trespass legal stipulations. And then finally, it's also important to always remember your research context. Your research context can be unique, and it may have unique methodological demands and procedures, for instance. If you think, for instance, about doing participatory action research, so your design will also have specific ethical demands that it will place on you. So my best advice to you today, then, after I've indicated that, please, you must remember the principles, you must understand this framework. And then my other piece of good advice is, if you are choosing a design, then make sure that you read about the ethical considerations relating to that specific design. I don't think researchers actually do that. They don't realize that if you, for instance, do participatory action research, that research will be situated within a specific philosophical position. There will be paradigmatic assumptions that will guide your functioning in terms of how you execute that specific study, but part of that will also be your specific ethical considerations. For instance, if you do participatory action research and you work in a community setting, knowledge sharing might be very important. This is an ethical issue, but if you, for instance, do a case study and you work within a different setting, maybe knowledge sharing wouldn't be important. If you do a phenological study, again, it would be important to really understand what is the ethical considerations of, for instance, doing in-depth interviews. If you do anonymous surveys, this will clearly have other ethical demands than when you are going to have in-depth conversations with individuals, and it might even be about a sensitive topic. So let me then move on and share with you that the key principles that you must make sure that you understand refers to your role then to promote autonomy. And we're going to talk about and unpack this in some next slides, but also you have a critical role to avoid harm and to maximize benefit. And then you have to ensure that you promote fair, just and equal selection of participants, and you must share the benefits and burdens of research equally. And if we think about the role of ethics review committees and also the role of my office in the university, it's actually to provide research governance in the institution, and that just refers to the regulatory processes that are designed to ensure that the principles that I mentioned above in red are upheld. Ethics oversight, in essence, mean that an ethics review committee will look and review an application to make sure that human participants or animals are protected against exploitation. And actually, it's important to love your research ethics review committee, to have a very good relationship with the person who is responsible for receiving your ethics application. Also to take care that you really complete the application form with diligence, with, really understand what are asked in the form in terms of the different sections of the form. If you are not sure, to consult with your supervisor, make sure that you obtain the necessary information, because you must remember that ethics review committees work very hard. It's really not a committee where you can be a member of the committee and you can just arrive at a meeting without maybe that you've even opened the agenda. It doesn't work that way, because you will have to provide input on ethics applications that has been tabled for discussion on the agenda for that day. So research ethics review committees then assist researchers to make sure that they don't actually miss important principles that could result in participants' rights being exploited. What are your responsibilities then as a researcher? In the previous workshop that I facilitated, I also said that I think it all starts with you reading. I often get requests from applicants in terms of certain areas that they may not understand in terms of a specific application, and I am willing to provide guidance and assistance. But I think what is important is, before you actually ask for guidance and assistance, make sure that you read, that you go on the internet, that you Google specific topics that might be of value to you, to make sure that you understand a specific aspect of your application. Make sure that you really burn the midnight candle. And as I've already said, please do not only read for the subject matter or the methodology. Ethics forms part of your methodology. Make sure that you really read about the ethical considerations of the design that you've chosen, information relating to the context in which you work, the procedures, for instance, the ethical considerations when you do in-depth interviews versus when you would do surveys. So your first responsibility then is to read. Secondly, you must understand that research ethics is not a compliance exercise. I love research ethics, and it's sometimes very sad for me when I engage and I review an ethics application, and I can really get a sense that this was merely a tick box exercise for the applicant. It is not about compliance. It's actually about growing yourself as a researcher. It's about being accountable for what you commit yourself to do. It's also about being more sensitive to ensure that when you make choices in terms of the operationalization of certain of the activities during the research journey, that you always should aim to improve human well-being. Research ethics is then evidently again about the application of responsible practices, specifically then relating to these principles that we are going to discuss. Another responsibility that you then have as a researcher is, remember that you must obtain ethics approval. We had a few cases of students that did not obtain ethics approval recently, and colleagues, that is really a very huge risk to yourself as a student, and a huge risk to the participants, but also a huge risk to the university. And actually what should happen is that if you did not obtain ethics approval and you completed your study, you can actually not use that data. So please be mindful that it is your responsibility to obtain ethics approval. Also, it is your responsibility to ensure the integrity of science. Please be mindful not to engage in plagiarism, falsification, or fabrication of data, or even questionable practices. It's important for you to understand how you should store your data. For how long will you store the data? Will you store the data with identifiers or without identifiers? Because all of this has certain ethical implications. But then also, you are part of this workshop this morning because you want to do the right thing, and the right thing is to build your competence. You cannot engage deeply in research ethics without understanding what research ethics entails. And for that, please consider to do the free training on this slide. And I know that Tanya is going to offer one pre-training session that she will facilitate for Masters and PhD students. But please remember that you can also do the online training in your own time, and I've given you the links there. So you are more than welcome to go and explore these links and then engage in this training. And I think it would be great for us if you inform us after you've done the training and maybe forward your certificates to us so that we can celebrate with you that you've obtained training. Then it's also important to actually ensure that you abide by the guidelines and the principles set out by the policy on research ethics. It's important that you report changes in the study that could influence the risks of harm to the participants to the Ethics Review Committee. In some colleges, the Ethics Review Committees are also called Research Ethics Review Committees. So please, if I use the two terms today, I use it actually as synonyms. And it's important that you undertake research that will contribute to knowledge. It's important then that when you decide on a topic for your study, that you must understand what are the priorities in your discipline, maybe what are national priorities. We all know that COVID is currently a very important priority across disciplines. Make sure that you really choose a topic that will contribute to knowledge in your discipline, so that it's not merely a case of regurgitating what has already been said. It's also important that you should publish in the end the findings in the public domain. I know about master students and PhD students who did amazing work, even my own students, but they've never published their work. And it's actually one of your responsibilities to make sure that the work that you've done over a 3-year or a 5-year or sometimes even a 7-year period can be put out there for the general public, for other scientists to build on the work that you have done, because as a researcher you play a critical role in building knowledge and generating knowledge. You're part of the knowledge economy, so to speak. Then it's also important to remain accountable for all aspects of a study. If something goes wrong, for instance, and you have not obtained ethics approval, you cannot blame the supervisor, because it's also your responsibility to make sure that you understand what are the requirements for conducting research within the space where you are registered as a student. Data management and secure storage of information are also very important. So you can refer to page 5 and 6 in the policy on research ethics if you want to understand your responsibilities as a researcher in more depth. And then if we look at the responsibilities of a supervisor, the supervisor is responsible for mentoring postgraduate students on research ethics and integrity. So it is important that the supervisor should have a conversation with you about principles that can assist you to consider research integrity, for instance, and the supervisor may, for instance, share with you the Singapore statement. If the supervisor does not share the Singapore statement with you, please Google the Singapore statement so that you understand on an international level, what are the principles guiding research integrity, and also what are your responsibilities in terms of research integrity. Your supervisor may also discuss with you the joint statement on research ethics and integrity that was released actually late in last year or early this year. I can't remember correctly, but it is a joint document that was released by the NRF, by ASAF, and by a few other bodies. And you will see that in the current Form 1 that is used by most of the colleges within Unisa, the joint statement forms actually part of Form 1 to raise your awareness in terms of your obligations as a researcher, specifically then focusing on research integrity. The supervisor will also provide you with active assistance to apply for research ethics. And the role of the supervisor is basically to prepare the student, to provide the student with the necessary information. Most of the colleges posted the application forms, for instance, on their websites. It could also be available on My Unisa, but it is important, if the student do not know where to obtain information, that the student can actually ask the supervisor for assistance in this regard. The supervisor can provide, for instance, information like a standard template documents that can be used for informed consent. There's also a cover letter that can be used and adapted by a researcher for survey studies. Your supervisor must also review the ethics application once you have completed the form, and the supervisor will then sign off the application and in that way recommend the application for approval. The Ethics Review Committee, on the other hand, is responsible to protect the dignity and the welfare of the research participants who volunteer to take part in scientifically sound research. It is important to note that I've underlined volunteer because to participate in research is a voluntary process, but also your study must be scientifically sound. So within the Unisa space, then again, in most colleges, there's actually a high degrees committee. And the high degrees committee will first scrutinize a student's proposal to make sure that the scientific aspects have been addressed. Because if this did not happen, the Ethics Review Committee will then do a due review. That is actually their obligation. I know that in many spaces, supervisors are sometimes very unhappy with ethics review committees because they feel that ethics review committees are trespassing on their ground. They believe that the Ethics Review Committee must only comment on matters that they believe is of ethical significance. But the reality is that often methodological issues can have ethical implications. And there is a saying in the fraternity of ethics that bad science equal bad ethics, and bad ethics equal bad science. For instance, if you do not have a very clear idea about sample size, you don't, for instance, understand what will be a representative sample, it actually means then that the findings of the study is not valid. So you have actually committed an ethical sin because you've wasted participants' time. Participants provided you with time, they engaged in maybe interviews that took maybe an hour and a half of their lives. They had to commit to do certain things, but in the end, the findings of the study may not be valid. So you've wasted their time. This is not a valid study. If other researchers use the findings or the conclusions of such a study, they are actually systematically eroding integrity of science, because one researcher will use findings that's not 100% valid, and then another person will use it, and in that way it's actually then eroding the integrity of science. So please be aware that ethics review committees must be very mindful that they do not comment on methodological issues just for the sake of actually commenting. They must, when they comment on methodological issues, they must be able then to link it to the potential ethical issues if the supervisor or the applicant do not consider some of the comments made by the committee. The REC or the ERC then is actually also then responsible to make sure that the welfare and dignity of third parties are protected. And that can be institutions, it can be communities, it can be maybe even family members, or maybe even community members. And in my example that I used previously, it could even be the transcriber. It's also important to protect the welfare and safety of researchers and or the research team. Colleagues, with COVID-19, this has become a critical concern of research ethics review committees. In the past, research ethics review committees would focus predominantly on protection of the rights and well-being of participants, and there would definitely be some consideration for the safety of researchers, but to a minor extent, and usually only when a topic is sensitive and maybe the participant or the applicant is working with a vulnerable community, and there could maybe be potential risks to this person, maybe working in a context of conflict, and maybe the applicant is doing research on riots, and in that context maybe is observing riots, he could maybe experience any bodily harm or maybe even psychological trauma. But with COVID-19, there's a toolkit. We have provided you with the COVID-19 guidelines, and there's also a toolkit. And this toolkit is not a static document, because we are learning every day more and more about COVID-19. But it is critical that you must protect yourself. You must protect your participants. You must engage in that toolkit. Currently, face-to-face data collection methods are still not totally supported by Unisa. You need to really have a very good reason why you want to continue with face-to-face data collection at this stage. You must have a clear argument, because there are definitely specific risks inherent to continuing with research amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's also then the responsibility of the REC to abide by a code of conduct and to respond timeously to requests for review. Colleagues, I'm going to share with you the timelines. I've heard that some students often complain that they would submit an application for ethics review, and then they say that it might take up to 3 or 6 months. Now, that cannot be the case, because this would not be in line with Unisa's policies and procedures, and I'm going to provide you then with the specific timelines. Committees are often overburdened, but even if they are overburdened, the committee should communicate with you. They should acknowledge receipt of an application. Step 1, if you do not obtain acknowledgement of an application, follow up immediately with your supervisor to find out for you, because that is not the way it should happen. Ethics review committees must also respect applicants. So the first respect that they can actually show to you is to acknowledge receipt of your application. In that acknowledgement of receipt, they must provide you with information when the committee will meet and by when you can expect feedback. So you must be aware that they have certain responsibilities. And if you feel that the committee does not abide by these responsibilities, it's your right then to ask the supervisor to find out for you what is actually happening. Please do not wait 3 or 6 months and then you feel very upset because you haven't received ethics approval, you've been delayed. I've heard about 1 or 2 cases where students say they then have to re-register, but that is really not, it's not on, because remember, part of your responsibility is also that you should be accountable to managing this project. Research is actually a project, and you should have very good project management skills. And a project manager working in a company, and you have to deliver on a specific project by a specific time. If you don't deliver, you will have penalties. So please utilize that mindset that this is a project and you must be accountable to manage the project so that your own progress is not negatively influenced by other systems within the university. So the Ethics Review Committee, as well as your supervisor, will then actually, and you as well, will engage in a process set out on this slide. Always it starts with reading. The supervisor, for instance, will read your application, will revise it, may even also read about specific ethical considerations relating to the design that you've chosen, maybe the context of the study, the participant group that will form part of the research, and then there would be a discussion. So within the ethics committee space, often your application will then be sent to 3 reviewers. The 3 reviewers will actually review it independently. There will be an opportunity for the application to be discussed on the committee, or if it is not on the committee, the information will be, or the review will be, feedback will be provided back to the chairperson, who may then discuss it with a small group, and then there will be a decision. And the committee will then, or the reviewers will then recommend the application either for approval, for a referred back to clarify certain aspects, to provide more information, or it might be disapproved. This happens very seldom. And if it is disapproved, also make sure that you receive very good guidance and information on why it has been disapproved. Also, when you receive your feedback letter and the application has been referred back, the referred back letter should actually include sufficient information for you to make the necessary corrections. And then remember that the Ethics Review Committee does have the right to monitor your research. And in the College of Human Sciences, for instance, and the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, these 2 committees are health committees. They are registered to the National Health Research Ethics Council, and actually they grant approval mostly for a 1-year period. And after a 1-year period, then you have to actually provide them with a progress report, and then they will reissue a new certificate. That may not happen in the other colleges, but please be mindful that the committee may, for instance, in your approval certificate states, if it's a sensitive topic, that you must provide a progress report maybe within a year or maybe within 6 months. So I want to stop here, Tony, and just ask if there are any questions at this stage. Tony?
Rita, maybe I can just come in here. It's Tanya. There were several questions.
Dr. Visagie, most of the questions were addressed by Tanya. Currently, there are no questions. You may proceed.
Thank you very much. Tanya, you must be my timekeeper, okay?
Okay.
So let's continue then. So let's now look at the structure of research ethics review committees within Unisa. You will see that my office, the Research Integrity Office, is indicated as a circle, and it's red. And this is the Research Integrity Office. And my office is then responsible to provide research ethics guidance, training, and governance to the other structures within the university. And this specific functioning, I report to the Senate Research Committee, and also my office provides services to the Unisa Research Ethics Review Committee, and this is also a subcommittee of the Senate Research Committee. And my office is also providing support to the Research Permissions Committee. And the Research Permissions Committee provides researchers with access to use Unisa staff, students, or data. So if you are going to do a study where you target Unisa staff, students, or data, please know that you will have to apply from your specific ethics review committee that deals with applications of students, researchers that are linked to that specific college. But you must also submit an application after you've obtained ethics approval from the research permissions to the Research Permissions Committee. So you will see there that there are actually 10 subcommittees then that reports to the UREC committee, and 2 of these committees are registered, as I've previously said, to the NHREC, the National Health Research Ethics Council, and this is the College of Human Sciences and the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences. And colleagues and students, with the exception of CHS and CEDU, all other colleges are actually using standard ethics application forms. There are 4 standard ethics application forms, and we are going today to focus on specifically the one standard application form. So if you are a student from the College of Human Sciences or from the College of Education, please note that your college uses different application forms, and we do not have time to go through all the forms, but you will still benefit, because I think the information that I will share will be generic to assist you in terms of applying for ethics, really with a solid understanding what is requested from you. So as a student then, and a researcher who is conducting research, you will apply on college level, and you will see that the College of Human Sciences only has one committee now. The College of Human Sciences does not have a number of departmental committees. It used to have departmental committees, but it has restructured in July, and it's basically now one committee that services all researchers and all students and supervised, let me rather say all students and all other applicants. Then you have the other colleges, and you will see that CAIUS also, there are 2 committees. It's the animal rec, if you do research involving animals, and then there's also a human rec that is registered to the NHREC. SEMS actually have a number of departmental committees, but in SEMS there's a central process of applying for research ethics. So all the ethics applications are actually centrally managed by Dr. Marianne Engelbrecht. So it will be very easy for you in that space, because if you apply for ethics, your supervisor will probably refer you to Dr. Engelbrecht, who will make the forms available if the supervisor has not made it available to you yet, and you will work through her office. She's the Research Ethics and Integrity Advisor of that college. In CAS, there's also only one committee, so it will also be quite easy for you. The SPL has one committee as well. CSET has more than one committee, and I think I'm going to ask Ms. Awisa to maybe just quickly explain the CSET structure to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rath. You find that in the CSET, we've got 3 schools. We've got the School of Computing, we've got School of Engineering, and then School of Science. School of Computing, it's mainly for computing students. And then School of Engineering, it caters for engineering. And then School of Science caters for 5 departments. The 5 departments are, we've got nanotechnology, and then we've got statistics, we've got physics, we've got chemistry, and we've got mathematical sciences. And you find that for the School of Computing, the chair who is responsible is Dr. Picuton. He's the one who is responsible for that. And then the School of Engineering, it's Professor Onyari. And then School of Science, it's myself who is responsible. Each of those schools have got a committee. So what happens, and what happens in the school is, when students apply, they should apply through their supervisors. And from their supervisors, the supervisor is going to forward the application to the departmental chair, because within each school there are departments. Like in the case of engineering, they've got civil engineering, mechanical engineering, and the like. And then in computing also, they've got too many departments. So what happens is the supervisor forwarded to the after cross-checking the application to the departmental chair, and then the departmental chair looks at the application, and then when she looks at the application, she now forwards it to the chair, like in the School of Science, to me. And then when she has forwarded to me, I then take that application. I've got my own committee, which is not the departmental chair, because each school has got their own committee, but there's also a departmental committee which will look together with the committee chair, and then they put it to the school committee. So when the department finished looking at that application, and then the departmental chair is forwarded to the school chair, in this case, which is me, I then take that application and then I circulate it among the members of my committee, and then from those members of my committee, they're going to review. And normally some schools have got 6 members of in the committee. Some like computing science, they've got more, and then some like engineering, they've got more. But in the School of Science, we are 6, myself and 5 other colleagues. And then when they've reviewed, now each committee member makes a recommendation. In our case, we look at if 3 of the committee members have approved. But the minute we see one committee member who has got an issue, we don't approve it. We then look at that issue to see whether that issue, we should really look at it. And in most cases, where there was no way where we haven't looked at it, we refer it back to the chair to send it back to the supervisor and the student. So that's the whole process in terms of the School of Science, Engineering and Technology.
Thank you very much for that. Then we have the College of Education, and the College of Education, they are actually having 2 committees, I think it's 2 school committees. The College of Graduate Studies, only one committee. College of Law, only one committee. And then the PRC is actually for professional staff within Unisa. And that is also only one committee. So now we've explained to you the structure of the Ethics Review Committee. And I'm now going then to move over and share with you the types of applications. So there are then different types of applications, and each type of application has a different form. So Form 1 is used by then all the colleges except for CEDU and CHS, and they have their own Form 1. But the Form 1 that we are going to focus on today is then specifically aiming to guide an applicant to address ethical issues relevant to research involving human participant data. We are not focusing on animal research today, but specifically on human participant data. And I'm going to explain to you in the next slide that we determine also the risk level of a study, because the risk level of a study will determine whether we provide a full review or we provide an expedited review process. Form 2 focuses specifically on secondary data. And these types of studies are predominantly seen as negligible risk studies. Obviously, a secondary data study could be low risk, specifically if the secondary data is very sensitive. It will also depend on the source where the researcher obtained the secondary data from, but this is usually seen as negligible risk studies. And then we have Form 3, and this is the non-human or non-animal research form, and this is then often used when you are, for instance, doing laboratory studies within Unisa, but we are in the process of establishing a biosafety committee, and in the future all laboratory studies will be reviewed by the biosafety committee, and there will be a total new form, because clearly Form 3 is providing very light review of laboratory studies, and that is why Unisa realized that there should be a more in-depth form, but we will keep you posted. So if you are doing laboratory studies, for now you will be using Form 3 then, but please just know that in future that may change. And then Form 4 is the progress report, and you actually use the progress report if there are any amendments to the study that could increase the risks of the risks to the participants of the study, or to maybe your research team, or to yourself as a researcher. For instance, at this stage with COVID-19, most studies are done online. So in the past, you have probably obtained, or a student might have obtained ethics approval to conduct face-to-face interviews. However, now you are maybe going to use Teams. You must provide a progress and amendment form and request an amendment to your procedures, your data collection procedures specifically, because the informed consent guidelines will now be different. With face-to-face, you will see the participant, you will have your hard copies of your informed consent letter document with you. The person will sign it, you will file it immediately, you will continue with your interview. But when you do it on Teams, for instance, or if you use another platform. This is not the case. So there could be specific ethical considerations that you now need to be very sensitive for. And that is why you must inform the committee of any changes to your procedures relating to COVID-19. Then the risk measurement. So how does the risk work? So within Unisa, then there are 4 categories of risk. Negligible risk, and this now refers to studies where there's an analysis of existing statistics or literature, documents and information in the public domain and laboratory research. And if we reflect back on the previous slide, you will see that this is an expedited process. Form 2 or 3 will be used if you do negligible risk research, and you should, in an ideal situation, receive feedback within 7 working days. So colleagues, please make sure that you understand the timelines linked to each application. We don't always live in an ideal world because maybe the reviewers might be busy with exam and there might be some delays that they do not submit their reviews back to the chair of the committee within the specific time. However, you then have the right to actually inquire why you have not received feedback within 7 working days in relation to negligible risk applications. Then low risk. Low risk studies involve participants that are adults. They are not considered to be vulnerable. It's a non-sensitive topic. And it's mostly anonymous data, or let me rather say the confidentiality can be protected, and anonymity in some studies can be secured for the participants. So it can be either qualitative or quantitative or mixed method studies. But it's important then to make sure that if you say it's a low risk study, it will definitely not involve vulnerable participants. It will not be sensitive in terms of the topic that you're going to do. Also the procedures, there will be no interventions, for instance. It will not be an experimental design, for instance, involving human participants with maybe pre-test and post-tests. So those studies would usually be seen as medium risk. So if we then continue, you will see with a medium risk study, the topic is sensitive, information gathered is personal rather than opinion or attitude based. It can also be a combination of both. The information needs to be collected with personal identifiers. So you need to have the name of the person, the student number, etc. And it could also be a vulnerable population. So in that instance, it's not expedited. So low risk studies are expedited. Let me just go back. I think I've missed that. It's actually expedited and it will usually not take longer than 3 weeks. It could take up to a month, but definitely not more than 6 weeks. 6 weeks would really be, I think, quite an extended period for an expedited review. But then you have full review, and this means that the application will serve at a full committee. 3 reviewers will still review the application, but the decision will not be made by a subcommittee, but by the full committee. And you will typically receive feedback within 14 days of that meeting. So it is important for you that you actually get access to the meeting dates. You must know when your application will serve at a specific date so that you can also follow up. And you now know that it should actually not take more than 14 days. So after 2 weeks, if you have not received feedback, it is your right then to follow up. High-risk studies are usually focusing on sensitive topics. It could be studies where the participants need to be deceived in some way to obtain valid findings. It can also focus on certain illegal activities. Maybe you are doing a study on human trafficking, or maybe you are doing a study focusing on incarcerated individuals within a prison context, maybe on a rape of elderly people, or maybe a child rape. So all of those studies are highly sensitive, and it would be classified as high-risk studies. And if you engage in those types of topics, again, it's also a full ethics review process that will be followed. The whole committee will be involved in making the final decision, and then you can also expect feedback within 14 days of the meeting. Additional types of applications refer to health research. So if you are doing research and the research fits the definition of health research, then it must be approved by a REC that is registered to the NHREC. And as I've already indicated, we have 2 of those RECs. So it doesn't matter if you are doing a study, maybe in the College of Education, and you are registered in educational psychology, and you are going to work with, let's say you work with disabled children. That study would definitely be seen as a health study based on the definition of health. And the College of Education committee is not yet a registered committee, but that specific college cannot actually approve that study. They will then have to refer that study to the College of Human Sciences. They can refer it to the College of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences also. But I think if you do such a study, please be mindful that you find out which forms to use before you apply for the study. Because I already shared with you that the College of Human Sciences, for instance, uses a different Form 1. And what it would mean is that you would now complete maybe the College of Education's Form 1, but it's a health study, it's referred to the College of Human Sciences, and now you will start to redo the application. We also have class approval for honours projects, and the class approvals are actually mostly completed by the supervisors or the study leaders that are responsible for supervising the honours students. You may, for instance, be requested to do an individual application, but mostly the lecturers and the supervisors want to actually rather do group work in the honours projects. So as you recall, we talked about the first responsibility of a researcher, and that is to understand the ethical principles and the convictions underlying moral reasoning. And within the Unisa context, we are abiding by the Belmont report principles. You will see that in our policy, that forms part of the part 2 of the policy, and there are reference made then to the principles that we are going to discuss today. So as an applicant, for instance, you can, in your methodology chapter, you can then actually refer to the policy on research ethics at Unisa. You can cite, for instance, the Belmont principles. You will then just need to read a bit wider so that you really understand the application of the Belmont principles. Tanya did provide you with a document that is actually going to be very, very helpful to you. And you will see that I am going to use the information of that document today to discuss the application of the principles. Because if I say to you, autonomy, that is a principle, you may still not know what do you need to do to adhere to the principle of autonomy. So if you think about a principle, each principle has a specific condition or more than one condition that you need to abide by. So let's now look at these principles. So if you look at the principles, then you will see that there are 4 moral principles. And these 4 moral principles form part of ethics in general, but it's also very relevant then to research ethics. First of all, it refers to autonomy, and autonomy then refers to the moral obligation to protect the rights and dignity of research participants. But if I say, how are you going to do it? This is what should be clear in the section in your proposal and also the section in your dissertation or thesis where you discuss the ethical considerations, the how. So I want to please encourage all of you, when you write your dissertation thesis, or any other research project, please use this as a framework to discuss the ethical considerations. There are other frameworks as well. If you work within community settings, you can also decide to use the SAN code. Just Google the SAN code. We do not have time to discuss the SAN code today. So I'm sharing this with you so that you know there are more than one framework that you can use. But in general, Unisa supports the Belmont principles as well as the SAN code in the new policy that has not yet been approved by Council. So beneficence then refers to a positive contribution that you will make as a researcher towards the welfare of people. Non-maleficence refers to your intent not to cause harm to the participants in particular or to people in general. If you think about non-maleficence, consider the study that was done recently by Prof. Nicolene Natras in UCT. She did a study focusing on why Black students do not necessarily register for a study in biological sciences, and I'm sure all of you remember the backlash that she received based on the findings of this study, because the general public and also scientific peers actually viewed the findings as creating stigmatization, not only for the participants of that study, but also for people in general, or Black people in general. So when you then consider the non-maleficence principle, remember it's not only focusing on the participants, but also on people that belongs to that specific participant group or people in general. And then the justice principle refers to your obligation to select participants fairly, to engage them in fair procedures, and to actually distribute the risks and benefits equally among people. That would mean that you should not target people for convenience to participate in a study if you cannot justify why you are actually using a convenient sample. So let's now look at the conditions, and I'm going to really go through this very quickly. So if we think about autonomy, Autonomy is then addressed through, I'm sure you know, through informed consent. So you need to make sure that you are very diligent in how you are going to obtain informed consent. And you must also make sure that if you work with a participant group with diminished autonomy, that you engage with consent monitors, that you obtain proxy consent, for instance, with children. You have to obtain assent from the children and consent from their parents or from their legal guardians, for instance. And it's also then important to make sure that you protect their privacy and confidentiality. And participants always have the right to withdraw from a study without penalty. And you must communicate that clearly to them during the informed consent process. If, for instance, you have an anonymous survey, it must be clearly stated that they cannot, unfortunately, withdraw. Once they have clicked the send button, because it's anonymous, you will actually not know who was withdrawn from the study, and that will not be possible. But that is why it is a good practice to use the Unisa standard template forms when you obtain informed consent, because it actually prompts you to ask and to provide the correct information. Then, just some clarity for you. Consent is provided by participants to participate in your study if they have the legal ability to provide consent, and also if they agree with the information that you've provided to them, and the information must be offered to them on a level that they can understand. The general standard is actually 14 years. So if you write your informed consent documents, please make sure that you don't use scientific jargon. For instance, in this phenomenological study, I'm going to depart from a hermeneutic position, and I am going to involve you in phenomenological interviews. They will not understand your language, and that would mean that they will sign the consent form without actually understanding. Also, if you work with participants and English is not their first language, and they are not fluent in English, also, it is your obligation and responsibility to translate the informed consent document as well as the data collection tools so that they can understand. I'm sure not one of us would feel willing to participate in a study, a vaccine study of COVID-19, if Spanish researchers invite us to participate in the study and they provide us with informed consent documentation in Spanish. So the same applies. Remember, the principle is autonomy, and you live it out through protecting the dignity of the participants. Assent is obtained from those that do not have the legal, that can legally not provide consent. This can be individuals with mental deficiencies, or it can also be children. And there then you will need proxy consent, but they must still provide assent, meaning they must be willing to participate in the study. And then permission. Permission refers to institutions. I've shared with you that if you want to use Unisa staff, students or data, the committee that will grant you access to staff, students or data is the Research Permissions Subcommittee. If you want to do a study in the correctional services, the correctional services must grant you permission. If you do a study in school settings, the Department of Education and the school must grant you permission. If you do a study in Telkom, you have to obtain permission from Telkom. So this is just clarification of these key concepts. Then confidentiality and privacy and anonymity. It's also important to understand these concepts. Confidentiality means that you can actually protect the privacy of your participants by not identifying them in your research report. But that doesn't mean that the study is anonymous, because anonymity means that participants cannot be identified in any way, not even by yourself. And privacy refers then to a person's ability and interest in controlling access to the person's information. And I have some information on confidentiality on this slide. We're not going to go through it, but I thought it might assist you to just understand the concept of confidentiality, specifically referring to the measures that you can apply to ensure confidentiality. Remember, in group settings and in focus groups, you can actually not secure confidentiality. There are limits to confidentiality that must be discussed with the participants beforehand. And then also some information about anonymity, but I'm just going to move on to the next slide then. So the next ethics principle refers to beneficence and non-maleficence. And this means that as a researcher, you must identify the risks of harm and the benefits of the study. You must make sure that you consider both risks and benefit. And please, I beg you, do not just say no risks. If you say no risks are anticipated in this study, always justify why you believe there are no risks. That is what the Ethics Review Committee would look for, the way you are justifying your risks. Then also, your study must be designed scientifically well to make sure that it will yield valid results. Also, if your study is of a sensitive nature, it is your responsibility to make a support system available for your participants. In the previous example, where I mentioned the transcriber that might now be involved in transcribing the transcripts that may have very sensitive information in that transcript, you may even think about how can this person be protected. You know, will it be necessary? There will have to be a confidentiality agreement first of all, but also can you maybe get a clear declaration from the person that she has been involved in these types of transcriptions in the past, so that she could possibly be sensitized to this information. So risk and benefit analysis, it's a high cognitive activity. It's not merely a activity where you say there are no risks. You really have to consider risk linked to the context of the study, the topic of the study, the participants involved in this study. Also, third parties that could be harmed relating to the study. Then, in terms of beneficence also, it is important then to ensure the credibility of science. So colleagues, in the application form, there is a reference made to how will you ensure validity and trustworthiness of a study, and that is important because this links to the benefits of a study. If a study is not going to yield valid results, we can really question the ethicality of that study. So you will also consider the available resources, and conflict of interest should be considered. I'm going to discuss that in the second part of the session. And then please remember that it's actually also your obligation to provide participants with feedback of the outcome of a study. This is not the act of kindness, it's actually an obligation, depending also on their level of involvement and the risk level of a study. If you involve people in medium and high risk studies, it's typically expected of you to actually to provide them with some feedback. And please do not say you are going to send them your your article or your dissertation or your thesis, because that is not practical. It may never happen. Rather commit to something that will work in that context. Think about your research and then commit to do the things that you promise to your participants. You could, for instance, provide them with a summary of the findings. And then if we do the benefit risk analysis, please consider the types of benefits. I find that people don't actually think clearly about their benefits. Ask yourself, who are the potential beneficiaries of this study? Will there be indirect benefits? Will there be direct benefits? Also, in terms of harm, consider, could there be physical harm, psychological harm, moral harm, social harm, economic harm? There can even be political harm that is usually part of social harm, and then legal. There could also be legal risks. So I'm going to then move on to the last slide of this part, and then we will break for to just maybe do a bit of a leg stretch and a comfort break. So the justice principle then refers to your obligation to measure the benefits and burdens accruing to participants as a whole, the community and society. And it's also important to not exploit participants and to expose them to a discriminatory treatment or to procedures that can actually be unfair. And the rule of thumb would also be that you can actually ask, the self-test rule is, if I am a participant, would I want to participate in my own study? And then discuss this with other colleagues, because sometimes we might have blind spots also. So justice are then lived out by making sure that you do not target vulnerable participants just for convenience sake. Make sure that you really consider your sampling, your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and I also see that in many studies, inclusion and exclusion criteria are very problematic. It's actually not well thought through, and also people who are likely to benefit from a study should not be systematically excluded. Let's think about incarcerated individuals. Just because it is difficult to gain access to incarcerated individuals, you know, we have an obligation as researchers not to systematically exclude them for research that can benefit them. This is just one example. Colleagues, so I'm then going to stop here because the next part of the session will now focus on Form 1. Welcome back, my dear students and colleagues. I hope you've enjoyed a nice cup of tea and or coffee, and you are ready now for the second part of the workshop. And the second part of the workshop will focus specifically then on the use and application of Form 1. And Tanya did consult the our SOP, our standard operating procedure. And Tanya, maybe you can quickly answer the student who asked about the renewal of an ethics certificate.
Okay, Rita, thank you very much. So the SOP, I've sent it to Tony, you also send it to you. There's a SOP with regards to the ethics certificates. It's stated in the SOP that it is common practice to disseminate research findings by means of conference papers, journals, books. Also now, when your dissertation invoice is in for assessment, so depending on when your research data was collected, if there is now if your dissemination of your exam is now in the period after your certificate has expired, this is acceptable. If the journal, for example, where you want to publish your paper, if they request the ethics certificate, then it should be then a justification then to ask for amendment of the time period and ask for a new ethics certificate. But if the data collection was already done, it should be fine if there will be no publishers that will request this.
Yeah, so I agree with Tanya. So in essence then, if you have already collected your data, no need to send in a request for an amendment. However, it may be that if you want to publish in future, the journal editor may request an updated ethics as approval certificate. They may not. So if they do not request it, I have published previously and provided approval certificates that also the period has also lapsed, and they didn't actually request me to provide them with a renewed ethics approval certificate. But if, for instance, they would require that, you can just ask the Ethics Review Committee to amend the time period. So let's then continue with the use and application of Form 1. And as I have stated previously, this form then is used as a standard template by all colleges, with the exception then of College of Human Sciences and the College of Education. So this form focuses specifically then on conducting research involving either primary or a combination of primary and secondary human participant data. You will realize that Form 2 focuses specifically on secondary data, but that would mean that there will be no direct involvement of human participants. So Form 1 has been developed to actually cater for secondary data as well, because clearly in some studies you would maybe want to make use of secondary data as well, but you don't want to now complete two specific forms, one for your primary data and then one for the secondary data. So I'm first going to quickly go through the form in a more generic way, and then we're going to take a form that has been completed and submitted to an ethics review committee for review, and we will discuss how the form was completed, and you will get an opportunity to experience what works in the form and what is currently not working in terms of how the researcher completed the form. So Form 1 then is divided in 6 sections. First of all, it's the researcher details, then the risk assessment. And with a risk assessment, please make sure that all of you have access to the Unisa Standard Operating Procedure on Research Ethics Risk Assessment. That document will really be very, very helpful to you. You can also cite that document in your dissertation and your thesis and in even your proposal, because it really provides you with guidance how to think about the risk-benefit assessment. Then this should actually be section 3, refers then to the details of the proposed research. Section 4 is a proposal summary sheet, and if you are an academic, you don't need to provide a specific individual proposal that can accompany Form 1. You can actually just complete Form 1, making sure that you really complete each field diligently and with the necessary information. But if you are a student, you must still submit a proposal. And colleagues, this is sometimes challenging, because you know what, sometimes you have submitted your proposal during your first year of registration, by the end probably of the first year. But depending on the guidelines from your college, maybe you are only going to apply for ethics approval when you are ready for your fieldwork activities, meaning that actually you have already completed your methodology chapter and your questionnaire has been sorted out, your data collection instruments have been sorted out. And by that time, your proposal might have changed. And this could then be challenging because the committee will then look at what you've written in Form 1, but they will benchmark that against what you have written in your proposal. So it's no need to clearly rewrite your proposal because that would be unnecessary duplication of effort. But what you then need to do is, if there are significant changes in that proposal, just include the changes in the proposal, even if you do notes and you just make a reference to how things changed. Otherwise, you will be in a situation where the Ethics Review Committee is actually going to refer the application back, and they may then ask you to clarify certain aspects. So for academics then, you will just complete the section 4 very clearly so that the committee can get a sense of the scientific elements of the study as well. Then section 5 focuses on your data analysis and design quality, and section 6 is actually the most important section. But to understand the ethical considerations, we do need to have access to the rest of the document as well. So let's quickly, I'm very happy my power came back. So I'm just quickly starting to work on 2 screens again. So life is very good on my side. So colleagues, let's then look at the first section. So the first section is a researcher declaration. And you will see that in the College of Human Sciences and in CEDU, the declaration may be different. They don't use this specific declaration, but please be mindful that the declaration must be signed by yourself and by your supervisor. If you do not have an electronic signature, please sign the document. And then once it has been signed, you can scan it as a separate document with your application. If you have an electronic signature, it is acceptable, but then it must be a legitimate electronic signature. It is acceptable that you then sign it, making use of your electronic signature. You will see that when you complete this declaration, please take note of for instance, the sections in red that say that I shall conduct the research in strict accordance with the approved proposal. I acknowledge that the approval is valid as long as approved procedures are followed. So if there are any changes, please make sure that, that you then highlight the changes. And also, if for instance, at a later stage, you may have obtained ethics approval, however, something may change, and then you will need to provide the committee then with a progress and amendment form so that the committee can then consider the changes and issue you with a renewed certificate. So you will see that is the statement, I shall notify the UREC it's actually not the UREC necessarily, it's actually your specific committee that granted you with approval of any adverse event that occur arising from harm experienced by participants, or then thirdly, if there are any changes to the proposal. So I'm then going to move on to your researcher details. I often see that the researcher details are not completed in full. For instance, a person might only share maybe an office number. And colleagues, I understand that obviously you want to also protect your personal information, even though you will see there is a privacy statement also that forms part of this form. But we may need to contact you, the ethics committee secretariat may need to contact you, and then if you don't have maybe a mobile phone or the best contact, or you don't provide the best contact number, that can also create delay. So please, that section, make sure that it is fully completed. You will also then see that we are actually using that information to issue the ethics certificate. If you work with co-researchers, it is advisable that each researcher's name should be on the ethics approval certificate, because maybe you are doing a joint study and you want to apply for internal or external funds, and if your name is not on the certificate, again you will need to go back to the committee and ask for an amendment to that certificate. In terms of the CV, you will see when we go through the application that sometimes the researchers will just take their ordinary CV and then they attach the CV that they would submit if they apply for maybe a work, a job, or a general CV, but that is actually not what is required with a CV. The CV should actually focus on your competence in line with conducting this specific study. And I hope it will make sense when we go through the application. The same with your supervisor. If you are a master's student, the expectation cannot necessarily be that you have extensive competence maybe in conducting a study, making use of a specific design, or maybe even focusing on a specific topic. But it could actually also be that you are actually very competent. Competence can be about maybe you are working in the public sector and you've worked in the public sector for 10 years and now you are going to do a study focusing on a specific aspect of your job, being a public administrative officer. And that would definitely ensure that you've got competence in the subject matter and in that specific field. Competence can also be that you have conducted as an honors student, maybe a project focusing on a survey design. So you do have some skills in terms of disseminating a questionnaire, or maybe you are doing a PhD and you have in your master's study you've done interviews and you have focused on a specific community setting. You are now extending the research, still focusing on that same community, then clearly you will have competence in working in that field. But it's definitely not referring to your generic CV. So my advice is actually that you don't necessarily attach your CV. You could actually only complete the fields in Form 1. I know that in some colleges there's a tendency to maybe attach that CV, but if you attach a CV, it seldom actually for the applicant addresses what the committee is actually looking for. Remember, this principle of competence links back to the ethics conviction of do good, beneficence. So the argument would be it's more complicated to do good and to increase the well-being of human participants, communities, and the public if you do not have competence as a researcher. It is one of your obligations to groom your competence. And that is also then why research ethics training is critical. And before you apply for ethics approval now, please make sure that you obtain ethics training. For instance, all of you in this session today, when you complete your Form 1 and you are using this specific Form 1, then under section question 4, when it asks about your research ethics training, you're going to say, identify the name of today's training, put down the date, and then you can say you've received level 1 training. Also, make sure that you do explore the tree training. I've provided you with a link in the slides. I've just sent the slides to Tony. You will receive the slides. There are also an online course for social scientists. And then you can actually, under this point, include the training that you have done already. This is not to discriminate against any applicant that you are not competent. It will actually also very seldom result in an application not being approved based on competence. It can only play a big role if a student is, for instance, doing research with a marginalized community. It's a very sensitive topic. The scope of study can be questionable in terms of maybe the context of this study, and maybe the supervisor is a very young supervisor who has never supervised a student, maybe focusing on this very sensitive topic. Obviously, then there can be an ethical quandary, but if that is not the case, very, very seldom. I mean, we've never actually disapproved an application based on the competence level, because also your supervisor will not be in a position to supervise you if he is not competent. So with the supervisors, I know they sometimes also experience frustration because they are requested with every student to submit a CV. So my suggestion would actually be for supervisors, just compile a standard CV for all your students with reference to these 4 questions. And then you can even submit it to the Ethics Review Committee. They can keep it on record, and then it is at record, and there's less frustration for you. Or alternatively, just when the student requests you for the CV, just send the student the standard CV and maybe update it on an annual level. So then we move on to the type of application. And I'm going to discuss this when we go through the form, but just be mindful that if you do health or health research, please, if you are not sure whether the committee is registered, stop completing the form and immediately consult your supervisor. You can also then request the supervisor to just communicate with the Ethics Review Committee, with the Secretariat, to provide guidance on whether this is a health study or not. And please engage with the Ethics in Health Research Principles, Processes and Structures, the guideline document of the Department of Health, if you want to understand this better. So then the next section is actually very, very, very critical. So for that, I've already mentioned it, but I'm going to say it again. Tanya did provide you with the SOP on Research Ethics Risk Assessment. All of you, even if in the College of Human Sciences, I've seen that their application form doesn't have the complete risk tool. Do yourself a favor, look at the complete risk tool so that you actually understand what the potential risks of your study will be. So the College of Education provides the complete risk tool as an addendum to the application form, but I have not seen, I've seen the College of Human Sciences form Thursday, and I did not see the complete tool. So go to the SOP and make sure you really do it, even if you do it only for yourself. All the other colleges, you will have access to the complete risk tool. So this is relevant to do a very solid risk-benefit assessment then. And colleagues, I'm not going to go through all of this. You will see this is a very suggested slide. It's actually not very good educational practice, but I thought it's maybe helpful. So please, you can go through this information. It's actually from the risk SOP, and it just justifies the importance of doing a solid risk assessment. So we are then going to continue to the typology of risks. So there could be physical risks, there can be psychological or emotional risks, there can be social, legal and political risks. And the information on this slide again comes from the standard operating procedure on research ethics risk assessment. Then the next slide actually focuses on your obligation to protect also yourself from potential risk of harm, but also you have an obligation to protect the university from reputational risk of harm. For instance, if you are going to do face-to-face data collection at this stage, and you've not really considered the risks of spreading COVID-19, and you do not notify the Ethics Review Committee of your intention, there can be a situation, even though it might be difficult to prove, but there can be a situation where participants may say that they have contracted this virus because of engagement with Unisa students or staff. And colleagues, that will be a very bad risk to the university. So please be mindful that we don't only focus on the protection of the participants, but definitely also on protection of third parties and the university as well. And I'm then going to move on to the next slide that focuses specifically on the nature of risk and how your participants' involvement in a study can increase the risk. So be mindful for confidentiality issues. Make sure that participation is really voluntary. If you are a lecturer and you are inviting your own students to participate in a study, the voluntariness can be compromised. If you are a community member and you are doing research in your own community, remember that your prospective participants might want to please you and voluntariness might be compromised. You also have to disclose specific financial interests, and then clearly also for laboratory research, for instance, you have to consider health and safety issues. So guided by the risk tool, and we are going to do a risk tool, but guided by that information, you are going to then decide whether your study is of negligible risk, and it can only be of negligible risk, and then you will never complete Form 1. If there is no direct human participant involvement, you can only claim that a study is of negligible risk if you are going to do non-human research, meaning you will do laboratory research, or you are a student in engineering and you are not going to involve human participants in your specific study, but and maybe you're going to use Form 2 for secondary data. But in all other cases, your research will then either be low, medium or high risk. And with low risk, there will then be direct human participant involvement. But it is important to consider that the only foreseeable risk of harm to your participants should be the potential for minor discomfort or inconvenience, and it should not pose a risk above the everyday norm. So for instance, it can be a qualitative study where you are going to do online interviews in the context of COVID-19, and you are not focusing on a sensitive topic, you are working with adults, they have legal capacity to provide you with consent to participate in this study. Or it's maybe an anonymous survey, but this would then be low risk. Category 3, medium risk. Again, it's direct human participant involvement, but now the research poses a risk above the everyday norm, and it could include potential physical, psychological, political, or social risks. But what's important here is that you can actually mitigate the risk of this study. So if you don't mitigate the risk, it can actually move to become a high-risk study and a category 4. But if you can mitigate the risk, for instance, you're doing your research and it focuses on maybe gender-based violence, you are going to have interviews with incarcerated individuals, but you have obtained ethics approval from the Department of Correctional Services. You have obtained approval from Unisa. You have made sure that you will be safe when you engage also in the prison context. Then the study can still be of medium risk. But for instance, if you don't consider these risks, maybe for transcribers, third parties, it will actually be a high risk study, and then it's a category 4 study. And this is when there are real or foreseeable risk of harm. You actually know there will be a risk, but the study is very important. The benefits will be huge, and therefore the university would allow such a study to proceed, because it's also linked to the justice principle that we cannot necessarily shy away from important research that can improve the well-being of the nation or specific groups of people. Then part of that section will be to describe the risks relating to the research procedures with participants, communities, or third parties. And in this section, you will then refer to, for instance, the potential participant discomfort. Maybe you are doing a study on the ergonomics of home offices, and you want the person to sit in a chair, in the home chair for maybe a 2-hour period to determine whether the chair would result maybe in hip pain. You have to then indicate that this will create participant discomfort. But what is so important is you have to match your informed consent documents with the risks described in your application. And when we do the application, the form now, we're going to see whether the researcher actually succeeded in doing that. You cannot have risks in the application form that's not in the informed consent document, because your obligation is to share with your participants the potential risks of harm. And so the risk can be physical, it can be psychological, there could maybe be persecution in some contexts, stigmatization, or even negative labeling could arise during the course of a study. And then you have to indicate how the potential risks of harm will be mitigated by explaining the steps that will be taken to minimize the likelihood of the event occurring. And then you also need to describe any steps that you will take in case of an adverse event. Colleagues, and mostly applicants are just saying not applicable here. But actually it could be applicable, because remember, the adverse events can happen, and in biomedical sciences an adverse event refers to, for instance, you are on a clinical trial and you develop severe symptoms. That would be an adverse event. An adverse event is sometimes also linked to something that you actually didn't plan to happen. But you know what, it can happen. Say for instance, you go to a community hall and you have a focus group in a community hall, and there's maybe a storm, and something happens that the wall of the community hall collapses. So I'm now using very extreme examples. That would be an adverse event. You haven't planned for this to happen, but it happened. And so the only thing that you can actually write there is you can write that you will inform the Ethics Review Committee of this adverse event as set out by the Unisa policy on research ethics, and then you refer to that specific stipulation in the policy. Don't say that it's not applicable, because it may be applicable. And then we are going to move on to section 3. So section 3 is another main area that then focuses on the details of the proposed research. And in this section, you are going to indicate whether you are going to involve any institutions in the research that must grant you permission. And you will indicate if the research project is funded or sponsored by any organization, because that could result in possible conflict of interest. You will also indicate if the study is a sub-study linked to an existing or a main study, and then the proposal summary sheet. So if you are a student, you must submit your proposal. I've said it already, but I'm repeating that. If you are a lecturer, no need, but please, colleagues, then do a good job of completing the proposal summary sheet. Bad ethics equal bad science equal bad ethics. So in the proposal summary sheet, there's reference to the background, the motivation of the study, and literature review relevant to the study. You can cut, copy and paste that from your proposal, but I'm going to discuss it when I go through the form shortly. But also, please remember that you need to describe your participants, and often you're going to use more than one group of participants. If you do a master study, maybe you're only going to focus on one group of participants, but it's often the case that if you do PhD work, or even on master's level, that you may work maybe with students, maybe you do a study on computing science learning within ODL institutions, you will definitely include your students, but you will also include maybe staff. So you will have more than one group. And if you have more groups, like you're going to also involve maybe the COD, then add just another row and include the other group as well. So the sampling is linked to justice, the justice principle. So it is not a methodological concern. Sampling is an ethical concern, because remember, the justice principle is focusing on to distribute the risks and benefits of a study equally across a population. So that would mean that the committee can question whether you are actually adhering to distributive justice or maybe social justice if you work in community settings, when they look at your participant groups. So we will discuss that when we go through the form in more depth. Then also describe how much time you require of participants in each group. So basically, how much time will you require from participants in each group, but also when will the data be collected? So this is also linked to the potential risks of the study. You don't want to inconvenience people. So this is an ethical question. When will the data be collected? If it's a student population, will you collect the data during exam periods? Apparently within Unisa, students are much more involved in completing Unisa surveys during exam, because they're probably more on my Unisa. But you have to consider the ethical implications of when will the data be collected. Then also, how will you obtain the contact details of participants? Now, this aligns to the Protection of Personal Information Act. Please consult the Department of Health guidelines on adherence to the Protection of Personal Information Act. They actually provide a very good explanation of how you can ensure that you abide by the stipulations of POPIA. You must then provide step-by-step details of how you will recruit your participants. My dear colleagues and students, we can no longer just obtain a list of names with email addresses from a specific company, because no company would be willing to give you with that list of names, because they might become non-compliant with POPIA, and POPIA, according to Prof. Da Vega, POPIA will definitely become in effect from next year. So it's very important that we are very sensitive to these matters. And I also see that people don't really think about this. Even the ethics review committees don't really think about how contact details will be obtained. And what happens then in the research permissions committee, for instance, where there's requests to gain access to Unisa staff and students, this was never picked up, first of all, by the student who now wants to make you gain access to Unisa students. Now they ask actually for a record and a database of all the Unisa students. They want to send out a survey to 400,000 students. Now, colleagues, it makes sense that it is ridiculous to provide a database of 400,000 students to someone to have that on a computer. Anything can go wrong, and ethics review committees must be very sensitive to this. And supervisors and students, please do not ask for these records, for instance, in the context of Unisa. If you do a survey, you will always say in this section that a survey will be disseminated via the gatekeeping assistance of Unisa's ICT. And clearly it will differ, because a few of you will do studies within the Unisa context, but the same principles will apply. If you do a study in Telkom, Telkom will definitely not feel comfortable to provide you with all this information. And that is why applying for ethics approval is a wonderful process. You might think that it is scary, but you know what? It actually prepares you for your field work. So my tip to you is, the moment that you start with your proposal as part of the first process, because the first process is completing your proposal, already obtain the ethics approval forms relevant to your college and to this type of study that you will do. And then look at what is required, because in your proposal, you don't even think about these things. You don't consider these things. Your supervisor may not actually think about it, because remember, in some colleges, they say you can only have 15 pages for this exercise. But my dear students and colleagues, this ethics application process is a process to plan for your field work. And if you do your planning now, your life will be much easier when you write your methodology chapter, because ethics approval requires of you to actually do your homework. You will need to find out where can you get access to this information, who will be gatekeepers, what will be required from you? Will you need permission letters if you maybe do a study in a private or a public company outside of Unisa? So that is why it is so important to not see research ethics application as a compliance exercise. It's not a compliance exercise. You also then have to consider if there will be a dependent or unequal relationship between anyone involved in the recruitment of the participants. So this is referring then to your position in the company. I am maybe the chairperson or the deputy chairperson of an ethics committee within Unisa, and I'm now going to do a study on the functioning of ethics committees within Unisa. Colleagues, can you see that by nature of the position there could be a power relationship, even if my colleagues are my peers, but there can be a perceived or a real conflict of interest. So in that instance, I will have to think about ways of obtaining informed consent so that it's still voluntary, and I should make sure that when I recruit participants, I don't use my privileged position of being in a specific position and also maybe having access to information that other people might not have access to. So this is why it is important to consider who will do the recruitment, and if there are any power issues or potential conflict of interest issues, the researcher may not be the best person to do the recruitment. In that instance, for instance, I could maybe request a third party to invite my colleagues to participate in this study, as long as that third party can be seen as relatively independent and also not being influenced by me in terms of my position, for instance. So then the collection of data material and procedures, very, very important, and we're going to go through this when we look at the application form now, but just be mindful in terms of how the questionnaire or survey will, for instance, be administered. Sometimes the applicant would say that this is an anonymous study, but then they are going to, I see less of this happening, but sometimes in the past they would say they're going to send the surveys out electronically via email, and they will also receive it via email. So clearly then this is not an anonymous survey. So you have to then explain how the questionnaire or surveys will be administered, and how confidentiality will be maintained, and also again, where will the data be collected, again, by whom will the data be collected. If you involve field workers, it's important that they should be trained, and please remember to then insert confidentiality agreements for all field workers. So if you involve field workers, they must sign confidentiality agreements. The next section focuses on interventions and then possible cultural needs, so you have to complete that. And I mentioned previously the importance of not violating participants' right to true full autonomy by providing them with English informed consent letters and English data collection tools if they are not fluent in English, because you are actually compromising their right to dignity by doing that. So if you are working within context where you have to translate documentation, please note that you must also attach a certificate from a certified language practitioner, and you must then attach both an English version and a version in the vernacular of the specific participants that you are going to target for your study. And this I'm not going to go into depth because it's just again about an unequal relationship between any person collecting the data and the participant, and clearly you all now know that this can compromise voluntariness and it links to the autonomy principle. And then the secondary data part is actually focusing on, say for instance, you want to include maybe student records, you want to maybe use student assignments, or you want to use maybe annual reports of KP, GM, whatever, you need to then include that as secondary data in this specific section. And then we go to the data analysis and design quality part, where you're going to describe your data analysis methods, and you will then provide the contact details of the statistician or external coder. And I also see that applicants just say that the study will not cost them anything. Colleagues, again, this is very bad planning. Remember now that you cannot do research without any cost. And as I've stated previously, nothing in this form is in the form just to make your life miserable. Everything in the form has a purpose. And for instance, say for instance you're going to make use of a transcriber. I've recently heard about a transcriber who she's going to transcribe 120 hours of interviews. The cost is 60,000 Rand for actually transcribing that interviews. If you haven't planned this sufficiently, where will you get 60,000 Rand to do this? This will compromise the quality of your study. Did you consider the services of a language practitioner who will edit the work for you? What is the cost? I mean, you actually need to do your homework now and put in real cost, because the thing is, if you apply for a bursary at Unisa, you cannot thug these things also. You have to provide them with real quotes. Now, actually the same apply to research ethics, but it's very interesting that often researchers are doing research that will cost them nothing. And this is again then an ethical issue, because remember, you need to think about your resources. Who is paying for research ethics or for research? Often you might get bursaries and subsidies. So the public and taxpayers are sponsoring many projects. Often you have to pay from your own pocket if you're not successful in securing a bursary, for instance. But that money comes probably from other sources. Maybe you are sponsored by family members, depending on your own financial situation. So please don't think that this section is only to make your life miserable. Please complete all sections in the form, because that is why the form has been designed that way. Then we are going to move over to the next part, and that refers then to the ethical considerations. And in section 1, please insert the information sheet and the informed consent documents. But you cannot only insert it, you have to provide an explanation here of how informed consent will be obtained. You have to explain the process of obtaining informed consent. And then with this checklist, colleagues, I very seldom see that people actually read what they're supposed to do, because the checklist actually states clearly that the participant information sheet ought to explain all criteria below, with the exception of those marked with an asterisk. So you will see that in your information letter, you must actually include reference to all information in this section below. Only R to V may not apply to your specific study. And I'm going to go through the application, and then you will see where the researcher also didn't understand this correctly. Okay, so we're going to then go to 6.3, and this is only when you deal with minors or with individuals that cannot provide you with legally with consent, then you will need to obtain assent. And remember, it's not only minors, it could also be maybe elderly people that cannot maybe provide you with a written consent anymore. It can also be those with maybe cognitive dysfunctions will then have to sign assent forms. And then data sharing is becoming very, very important. So colleagues, please consider data sharing. In the policy, the 2016 policy states that you must store securely all raw data for a period of 5 years. But please, again, research ethics is not a compliance exercise. You have to think you are researchers, you are the next generations of researchers. If you are students emerging or developing academics within Unisa, consider that you may do a longitudinal work. You may probably also use the data that you have collected in this study, maybe for a similar study in the future. You might want to use it for comparative reasons. So again, don't just say, I will keep the information for 5 years. First of all, think about the nature of the information that you will store. If you are storing information with personal identifiers, POPIA clearly dictates that you are not allowed to store it indefinitely. So what you will have to do if you want to store it indefinitely, you will have to de-identify all raw data sets. But if it is de-identified data sets, you can store it for up to 15 years or even longer. And the Unisa library has a repository service where you can store your data securely without having the risk that maybe someone can steal your computer, maybe you didn't store information on the cloud and you may lose your data. So this is then section 6.5 is all about data sharing. Then 6.7 is about your obligation to provide your participants with the findings of the study. And we have discussed that earlier, so I'm going to rather move to 6.8 that focuses on the use of indigenous knowledge and property rights. If you work in communities, you do participatory action research, this might become very relevant. Maybe you work in a community, they assist you with determining your design of your study, then they might even become authors of the publication, or they might be needed to be acknowledged. So that is then very important. And then we're going to move on to the last section, benefit sharing. Again, it's not necessarily done, but in community engaged projects that might be relevant. And how are you going to envisage publishing the research? And then are you going to provide compensation to participants and compensation, including reimbursement? Please note that gifts is not compensation. Gifts are more like incentives. Sometimes you need to give compensation. If you take a street vendor from the street and you put the street vendor for 3 hours in a focus group, the street vendor loses income. However, if you give incentives, it could again compromise the principle of autonomy, and your participants might participate only because they are getting maybe a form of an incentive or a gift. But again, ethics is really about disclosing what you want to do. Please don't think, you know what, I'm just not going to say it in the ethics application. I will still do it because in some context it might be necessary to give people something to eat. And is that an incentive? Well, we could argue whether it's an incentive or not, but sometimes we could argue that it's just good manners also. So I'm now then going to move on to the next section, and that is just how to apply, and then we're going to go through the form. So if you want to apply for ethics approval at Unisa, and I'm now referring to Form 1 specifically, but this will actually apply to Form 1, 2 and 3. or even with amendments. First of all, familiarize yourself with the Unisa policy on research ethics, and Tanya did provide you with that document. If you want to involve Unisa staff, students or data, please also then familiarize yourself with the Unisa policy on conducting research involving Unisa employees, students or data. Always make sure you understand the Unisa standard operating procedure on research ethics risk assessment and how it applies to your study, and then obtain the dates, the meeting dates from your supervisor. If it is not published on the website or on the My Unisa space, please get these dates. Remember, you are busy with a project, and project planning is critical. You cannot just go in blindly and November now you want to submit your application for ethics approval, because maybe in December the committee will not meet. So please make sure you obtain the dates, and usually you must submit your application 2 weeks in advance. The agenda would typically close 2 weeks, so again, plan for that. Then step 2 would be that you will engage with your supervisor so that you can obtain the relevant application form from the supervisor or from the ethics review committee, and you must consult your supervisor for guidance. Go through the form, make sure that you clarify areas in the form beforehand with your supervisor, so that you don't set yourself up to be randomly successful. Rather set yourself up to become strategically successful by engaging in this form. And as I've mentioned previously, please start with this process thinking about what needs to be included in the form already during the proposal phase of your study. Then the next step would be complete all sections. Colleagues, please, and students, don't just leave a space blank. Say not applicable, but complete all sections in detail. Then once you are satisfied, email the completed form to your supervisor for sign off, and the supervisor will then submit it to the ethics review committee. Usually in most colleges, it's not the responsibility of the student to submit, it's the responsibility of the supervisor to submit the application. When returning the form electronically, or when you send it basically to the ethics review committee, and when you send it to your supervisor, make sure that all the supporting documents are attached, the data collection tools, the participant information sheet, the consent form, cover letters, permission letters. Remember, the permission letters sometimes will just be proxy permission, or let me rather not say proxy, it will be template permission letters. In some instances, the committee would actually want you to already have obtained permission from the institution, say for instance, Telkom or maybe another company. But for instance, the Department of Correctional Services, they will not grant you ethics approval or permission without first obtaining ethics approval from Unisa. So this is a bit challenging at times. It's almost like we're not sure between the hen or the egg, but just mitigate, manage and find out how this works before you submit for ethics approval. And if you want to use flyers, scripts for recruitment, posters, this must actually also be scrutinized by ethics review committees. I see that in the context of Unisa, this actually seldom happens, but actually you are supposed to even submit the recruitment email to the committee so that they can make sure that the autonomy principle is not compromised. Then step 4 is the review of the application. An ethics reference number will be immediately allocated, and use this number in the subject line of all correspondence with the ethics review committee in future. Also, you must use this unique reference number in all communication with your participants. This makes things very simple. If, for instance, you need to quickly search your inbox, it's easy for you to just put in the unique reference number. So this number is issued with a specific purpose. It provides the committee with a tracking system. If you want to find out 5 years down the line about an ethics approval certificate, maybe you've lost your certificate, it's very difficult for the committee to actually obtain that document for you without having this tracking number. Then the committee will, the secretariat of the committee will typically do a pre-screening. And during the pre-screening, in most committees, you will actually receive feedback already if the person who's doing the pre-screening realizes that the application has not been completed fully, and if the person realizes that there could be ethical challenges with this application. So then it's sent back to the applicant to rework it. It's sent back to the person who did the pre-screening, who will then decide that the application will be tabled for consideration and sent out to the reviewers. So each application is reviewed by a subcommittee, and if it is a negligible risk application, the chairperson can actually approve that application, or a senior member of the ethics review committee. And as I said earlier, this can happen within 7 days. If it is a low risk study, the chairperson with a secretary of the committee will select up to 3, usually it's 3 reviewers. It's better if it's 3 reviewers, because if you have 2 reviewers and one reviewer say yes and one reviewer say no, it's actually even more difficult to negotiate. So it's much better that all ethics review committees send applications to at least 3 reviewers, and these 3 reviewers will then independently do the review. They will submit their review reports. The chairperson will consolidate the findings, and then the ethics approval feedback letter or certificate will be issued, and this can typically happen within 3 weeks, depending on the schedule of the ethics review committee. But after 3 weeks, you can start to inquire. Then with medium and high risk, it will always wait for a meeting date. And so if you send in your application package and the meeting date is maybe only the end of the month, it could typically then take 6 weeks, because you will have to wait a month before it's tabled for deliberation, and then you will wait 2 more weeks for the committee to provide you with feedback. And you will see the decisions are just noted there, and I've already shared that. So I'm going to move forward to step 5. Feedback will now be provided to the applicant. The unique reference number will be used. And please also, if it's referred back, after 3 months, you cannot just now submit your application for a review by the committee only for the amendments. You will need to apply from scratch. So please, after 3 months, the committee will remove the specific application from the agenda. So if you receive a referred back decision from the committee, you have to reapply within the next 3 months. It must be tabled on the agenda of the committee within a 3-month period. If there are then comments, you will do your resubmission, highlight all revisions in the amended documents, and also write a cover letter explaining how you have addressed the comments. Just as the committee should respect you as an applicant and not take 3 to 6 months to review your application, you should respect the ethics review committee also. Please don't be messy in the process. If you resubmit something, take your referred back letter to go through everything that was said in that referred back letter and respond, indicate how it has been changed, where it has been changed. This is a standard practice across all universities globally. I applied from the University of Stellenbosch recently, and we also had to abide by these. It is common decency principles. So then that is that. And so I'm going to give you just a 5-minute break. So we will resume within 5 minutes while I'm quickly setting up the application.
There is some uncertainty about when students must submit their ethical clearance. For example, students have a deadline of 15 October for their proposal, but it's also not clear how colleges use this. I know there's differences in CHS from previous workshops that we have. When do I submit for ethic clearance? After the research has been, the scientific part has been approved?
Now, you find that in the College of Science, Engineering and Technology, we normally, before the COVID, we normally said the students should submit their ethical clearance after their proposal has been approved. But now we have got a waiver because people like physics and chemistry, for the student, for their proposal to be approved, first of all, they need to test their data, whether it's answering their objective research questions or hypotheses, whether the data is going to conform to what they've got. Now, because of that, and they cannot go into the labs now without ethical clearance, we have got a special letter which is written by the supervisor, and it is also stamped by the chairman of department, indicating that this student, in order for them to have their proposal complete, they need to test their data, and therefore they need ethical clearance for their project to go, for them to go into the lab. We have done that for chemistry in the past weeks, and we have done that for physics, because in those cases, the student cannot get their proposal until they know that what they intend to do, the data conform to that. So we have got such a clause. But on the other department like statistics and mathematics, we give ethical clearance after the students have done their proposal. And in this case, when they submit their ethical clearance nowadays, they submit it with the proposal letter, which shows that their proposal has been accepted, or that letter which states from the department that they need the ethical clearance to go and conduct data in the lab for them to know that their research questions and objectives will be answered by that data.
So I think what is important is that there are two ways of actually looking at that, and I think whether the M&D procedures, the latest revision, actually suggests that students should obtain ethics approval simultaneously with proposal approval. However, this may not work consistently in all fields and in all colleges. So some colleges are actually doing exactly that. For instance, I know that the College of Human Sciences, I think in that college, the students will obtain ethics approval consistently with when they obtain their proposal approval. It will be in a way a tandem process. But in other colleges, for instance, such as the College of Economics and Management Sciences, the student may want to do a survey design. The questionnaire has not been already developed at proposal phase, so that would mean that the student will actually have to apply for ethics approval, but the student cannot submit all the necessary supporting documents. In that instance, for instance, the student will then rather apply for ethics approval prior to fieldwork activities. But I think what students should do is they should consult their supervisor so that the supervisor can find out what is the status of that college. In the past, in the previous M&D procedures, it was stated that students can obtain ethics approval prior to fieldwork activities, and that then allowed for students actually to first work on the methodology chapter to finalize their questionnaires, their research instruments and tools. But for now, I think consult your supervisor. That would be the best way of dealing with that. So I'm now continuing, and we're now going for the last half an hour. We will go through Form 1. Unfortunately, we do not have sufficient time to go through Form 2 and 3 as well. But if there is a need, then the students can maybe just indicate that need and we can see how we can address that need. So colleagues, the first part of the Form 1, actually, I hope you can see it. I'm going to make it a bit, let me just minimize it slightly. Let me do that so that you can still see, and you also see the comments, and you will receive this application. So the first section in this form provides the committee with guidance on the risk level immediately. Because the question is, it's going to involve human participants, yes, so this is the correct form that the person is using. It will be by both direct and indirect use of both primary and secondary data will be used, that's included. The person is now saying personal or confidential information will not be collected. Now, colleagues, I've not at this stage seen the application. So this is a staff application. So there's this is actually, let's say this is a staff member who's also a student. So there must also be a proposal. But immediately as a reviewer, I will tell myself that I must check this in the risk section, because I already know that researchers do not actually understand what is meant by personal or confidential information. You must know that if you have face-to-face interviews and a participant sign a consent document, it is no longer anonymous. It is immediately personal information that you actually have of that person. So as a reviewer, I am reminding myself that I should now check the risk assessment, because you will see there must be alignment between what the applicants say and what is in the rest of the form. Then this section, please complete the date submitted to the Ethics Review Committee, because if you want to follow up on delays, you must actually have evidence that you submitted this on a specific date. So if you're an applicant, please complete this section and say you have submitted it on 20 August 2020, for instance. Also, is this a previous application, or is there a previous application number? Maybe this is a resubmission. Then you can just put in the previous application number here. Let's say it's maybe CHS and maybe it's 006, something like that. And this next section is actually for audit purposes of the committees. The committees are audited. Unisa takes research ethics governance very, very seriously. We don't want students to complain about delays. We don't want students to be compromised, to say that, you know what, we couldn't maybe submit on time, now we have to re-register. That would not make sense. So please, you can leave this section open, but this is for the committee use, and all committees must make sure that they actually complete this section, because if they are audited, the audit committee will focus on the information provided in this section. This is just a privacy statement, and again, the Unisa must abide by the Protection of Personal Information Act. So it is very important that as an applicant, you must know what will happen to your personal information that is provided in this application form. This is the declaration. So this person completed the declaration, and then the applicant didn't sign in full. So this is just it's like a sample application for training purposes. So obviously we will accept it for now. But if we receive an application and it's not signed, or it's maybe the name is typed in, then it will not reach the committee. It will be immediately sent back to the applicant to complete this. Okay, and then the supervisor signed. And remember that the supervisor must sign after he has reviewed the application. It is the responsibility of the supervisor to go through this application. Then I already shared with you, please complete this section in full, because this information is critical for issuing your approval certificate or to contact you. And this is then the section referring to the CV. You will see that this is what the researcher said. Experience relevant to the proposed research. He said that the focus of this study is to develop computer science learning in both traditional and ODL universities by making use of a mixed methods research design. I have been a computer science lecturer for the past 6 years at Unisa. During this time, I've gained knowledge, skills and competence in developing curricula and learning material within an ODL context. I have not worked in traditional universities, but I plan to do a comprehensive literature study to gain a better understanding of the research phenomenon relating to this context. Now, just reading that statement, as a reviewer, I am put at ease. I know that this researcher understands his obligation to be competent to do research. And if you just attach your work CV, I'm not comfortable about it, because you actually don't address what you're supposed to address. Then qualifications relevant to the proposed research. I have completed a master's degree in computer science, employing a quantitative design. Okay, so now the study is mixed methods, but it is clear that he understands quantitative designs. And then publications and other research outputs. He did not publish yet, and that is in order, because I'm sure the supervisor published in specifically on computer sciences and maybe specifically learning. And then research ethics training done, and this applicant said that he did online certified 3 training. He did modules 1, 2, 3. As a reviewer, I am very happy. I can give him a smiley face here because I'm confident that he understands the obligation. The supervisor is saying that my supervisor has extensive experience in computer science in both traditional and ODL context. He has been a research professor in computer science for the past 16 years, of which the last 8 years was at Unisa. Qualifications relevant to the proposed research. He has a PhD in computer science. And then, he should list the most important publications. Again, it's not necessary to list 20 or 30 publications, but maybe 5 or 6 publications relevant to the type of study. If it's it will be computer science because he's a professor in computer science, and that will suffice. Or then if you want to attach a CV from the supervisor, just make sure that the CV actually addresses these questions. And the supervisor participated in research ethics training offered by the Unisa Research Integrity Office. and he did level 1 training and he did it on 10 June. So the committee will be very happy, no issues with this. There's no co-supervisor, there are no internal or external co-researchers. The title of the study, Developing Computer Science Learning in both traditional and ODEL universities. So that's the title of the study, and usually we just say that the title should be not longer than 16 words, but again, this is just a guideline. Obviously, this application already served at a higher degrees committee, so we can assume now that the title of the study is in order for the high degrees committee. But one thing that you must remember is, please be careful not to identify institutions or to identify communities in your title. We recently had a study done by a student in the College of Law, and this student wants to do a study in the prison context. Also, it's actually in a community. It's not in the prison context. It's in the community. But he wants to interview police officers, but the police division do not want to allow him to actually interview the officers. So if you now identify that community, and the study focuses on undisclosed rape, can you see that it can actually result in stigmatization of that community? There can be the notion that this is a community where numerous women have been raped. So even as someone in that community that's not a researcher, you might start to wonder if your partner has not maybe been raped and she's not disclosing this. So it is very, very important that you think about third parties and think about their right to autonomy as well. A third party has also a right to be de-identified, and or let me rather say not to be identified. The same with Unisa. We get many studies where researchers are actually using the name of Unisa, and even though we have a balanced perspective to say in some studies it might be necessary to use the name of the university, we often refer these studies back from the permissions committee to say that the applicant need to go back to the ethics review committee to remove the name of Unisa in the title. So this is just some tips on the title. Then the person is saying that this study is for non-degree purposes and it's a PhD in computer science. And his niche area is then ODEL, so there are no issues with that. Then he is saying that he is going to send out a survey. He's also going to do focus groups. Okay, so now immediately with focus groups, as a reviewer, I already now know that there will be limits to confidentiality. So I must now make sure that in the informed consent documentation, there must be a clear indication to the participants that there will be limits to confidentiality. As a researcher, I can promise you confidentiality if I have a one-on-one interview with you. But if I work with 10 people in a group, I cannot promise confidentiality. So then he's saying he will also do interviews. And he's going to use student assignment marks, exam marks and final marks. So clearly now it is clear that these student records will contain personal information. So can you see there's now at this stage a bit of discrepancy about what the applicant stated in this section, because here he was saying that he's not going to collect personal or confidential information. However, if you use student records, if the applicant is not going to ask someone to de-identify this information, he will actually have access to personal information. If there are any questions about these aspects, please feel free to ask questions, and then Tanya, you can then maybe just stop me. Okay, so I'm going to continue then. So can you clearly see he will also need to obtain permission from the Research Permissions Committee, because he cannot just use student assignment marks, exam marks and final marks without Unisa permission. Then the risk assessment. So the risk assessment, the first section of risk assessment tries to determine whether this is a health study. So the criteria that you see here all relates to the definition of health according to the National Health Act. And this applicant is saying that he is going to do research that will involve social processes in human beings. So typically that would now be seen as health research. However, he's now making a case in the comment section. So if you tick yes in any of these if you tick yes on any of these criteria, please, you must then expand in the comment section. So he is saying the research relates to the social processes around learning in traditional and ODL environments and how to support such learning. No health-related data is involved. So I would agree with the person, and it's not necessary then to send this application for review to Registered Ethics Review Committee. Then the next section now focuses on the type of participants that are targeted for this study. So this section tries to determine whether the participants are vulnerable or not. So he is saying that he's not going to work with young people. He's not going to focus on individuals with disabilities. He's also believing that, you know, persons that might be vulnerable will not form part of this study. And again, we don't have time to discuss that, but often students are sometimes seen as vulnerable. But this will result in another half-hour debate. So let's for now park that. He's going to work with adults. So let's agree with him. And then he's saying also he's not going to work with a community that is vulnerable. He's going to work with Unisa employees, students or alumni. And I just made a note for myself that this will mean that he needs to obtain permission from the RPSC. He's saying that all the participants can actually read, speak or understand English, and he believes that they will not, there's no possibility of them being identified. Again, he ticked yes under Unisa or next to Unisa employees, so that means that he must now write something in the comment section, and he did that. He said, I will apply for permission to gather data from and about Unisa students from the Unisa Research Permission Subcommittee. The next section of the risk assessment focuses on the types of activities. Obviously, some research procedures yield greater risk than other procedures. So he is indicating that he's not going to collect or process personal identifiable information without the consent of an individual or institution that is in possession of the required information. Okay, so in this case, he's going to make use of Unisa records, exam marks, etc. So even though assignments and dissertations and theses within the Unisa context are actually the property of students, Unisa has a license to use this for research purposes, and on the registration, all students actually sign that they agree that Unisa may use this license to do research. So this is acceptable. Then collection, use and processing of personal identifiable information directly with prior informed consent. So let's quickly look at this. So he's saying that he's going to do not collect, use and process personal identifiable information directly from participants with prior informed consent. Now it is important to actually understand what is meant by personal information. So the Protection of Personal Information Act defines personal information as any information that can result in an individual to be identified. So it could be your name with other identifying information. For instance, maybe your name, your student number, your staff number, your ID number. It's also providing guidance on certain special information. If you ask people to identify their gender, their race, their sexual preferences, criminal records, all of those elements of personal information can only be requested if it aligns to the aims and objectives of a study. It's no longer acceptable actually to just obtain demographic information for the sake of obtaining demographic information. So as a reviewer now, I am just making a note for myself to check his data collection tools. He's going to do a focus group. So in the focus group, people will be identified. And I am sure that he is going to do it with prior informed consent. So actually, I don't think this is correct. I think maybe he misinterpreted this section. So I am highlighting this because obviously this can result in the application being referred back, because it is very important for the applicant to actually be sensitive to private information. Or alternatively, if this is the only, if this can be seen as a minor issue, depending on the nature of the information, then it could probably be conditionally approved with a request for an amendment. But for at this stage, as a reviewer, I wouldn't know this already. Then personal identifiable information to be collected about individuals from available records. Yes. But again, this is not consistent with the information that he provided on page 1. So can you see how important it is actually to make sure that you provide information that is consistently the same? And then also personal identifiable information to be collected outside. So this is not a collaborative study. The information will not be sent to colleagues in the United States. Personal identifiable information to be shared with third parties. So at this stage, he's not going to make use of a transcriber. So if, for instance, he wanted to make use of a transcriber, this should have been yes, and there should then have been a confidentiality agreement. So I did check the application. This is in order for now. And then this is definitely not a sensitive study. So I'm going to skip these because we don't have a lot of time. But colleagues, you will see then that I agree with the rest. But again, every time when there are specific ticks in this row where it's yes, you have to describe it in the comment section. And for instance, I'm not too happy with what he's written here because I'm not sure if he will de-identify the student records, and I'm also not too sure you know, what will happen in the focus group. So at this stage, I've got some concerns about the application. Then if we continue, there are no risks to the researcher, and also he is saying that there will be no inducements, but I am concerned about the fact that he doesn't think that there could be any conflict of interest. Now, he is the lecturer of these participants, or he's also maybe working with his colleagues. So this could be perceived as conflict of interest. So I would rather opt for a yes here, and then he should actually explain perceived or real conflict of interest in this section. Okay, so let me continue then, and then if we go on to the risk category, I agree with him that it is definitely a low risk study. And he is saying that student participants will be asked to respond to an anonymous questionnaire, and there will be no way of linking responses to a particular student. So now we know that his survey is really anonymous. Assignment marks will be dealt with in summary form, and no individual marks relating to a participant student will be sourced. So maybe he will have access and he will know the identity of the individuals, but he's saying that it will be reported on in an aggregated form. And so the committee will then have to decide whether it's going to be an issue that these marks are not de-identified by a third party. And then he's also saying lecturer participants will participate in a focus group. But colleagues, again, he's knowing this lecturer, so I still agree that it's low risk, but there could definitely be potential conflict of interest, and he's not aware of so it's like almost a blind spot. He doesn't consider potential conflict of interest, and I'm now speaking according to my view as a reviewer. Then the benefits, the aim is to improve student learning, experience of and results in a computer science programming module. There is a possibility that current students may well benefit from interventions taken, and that benefits may not be only experienced by future students. So he's arguing that this study can have direct benefits, but it's actually not 100% clear how they will benefit. So as a reviewer, I may let this slide because this is a low risk study, but if this was a high risk study, I would not have been satisfied with this benefits. I would have wanted to see actually what would be the interventions and what would be the specific benefits. Then he's saying that there are no risks are envisaged, but then he's actually identifying a very important risk. He's saying beyond those of a student being concerned that by not participating or being honest in their responses, it will lead to victimization of the lecturer. Now, this is a serious risk. So can you see he is actually in tune with the fact that there could be potential or real conflict of interest? Now, as a reviewer, I will immediately go to the information sheet, you know, the informed consent documents, to see if he's disclosing this, because he must disclose this to them in the informed consent letter, and I hope we will have time to have a quick look at that. And then he's saying that the lecturers will meet in a professional forum where there may be some reputational risk. At this stage, I would refer this application back, because the thing is, I don't know what the reputational risk will be. It's not clearly described. It is problematic. The risk assessment is critical for an ethics review committee. So I've already made up my mind. I will go through the rest of the application so that I can give solid feedback to this reviewer, but this application will already have been stopped in our committee in the pre-screening phase because this is not clear. Then the potential risk of harm, how will it be mitigated? A sense of collegiality. No, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what it means. I'm definitely not sure how the risks will be mitigated. And then adverse events not applicable, rather refer to the policy on research ethics to indicate that adverse events will be dealt with according to policy stipulations, the policy on research ethics. And then indemnity, yes, that is not applicable, I agree. So the details of the proposed research, he is indicating that he's going to make a request to Unisa, the Research Permissions Committee, for approval. He's providing everything necessary here. He's also going to contact University B. He's going to contact the Ethics Committee. He's going to get ethics, permission. I'm not sure if the Ethics Committee will grant this permission, so I'm actually raising a question here. Maybe he did do his homework well, but maybe he didn't do his homework well. He wants to get the application in, so he didn't contact University B to find out who will actually grant this permission at that university. It's typically not the Ethics Review Committee, separate process. And then, okay, yeah, Tanya? Okay. So then the permission letter, he doesn't append it here because he can't get permission first without ethics approval. And okay, so he's just then explaining also why it's, if permission is pending, provide an explanation. He's actually not doing that. He's actually not providing that. Then are any of the researchers members, or do they have an association? So this is now conflict of interest. He now realizes that there's conflict of interest. He's saying the researcher is employed as an academic at Unisa and teaches the one course indicated in the research. So this now confirms my opinion that there could be real or perceived conflict of interest. So he did explain his association. He should have addressed this as a risk in the risk assessment section that we discussed previously. Does your research involve collectives or communities? He's saying no, I agree. Is your project funded? He is saying no, it's not funded. He's also saying that it's not a sub-study. But now with this section, proposal summary sheet. So he's a PhD student. So as a PhD student, whether you're an academic, if you're an academic, you should still provide a proposal. So the proposal should now be included as part of the documentation. So what he did now was, he said that the introduction, motivation and literature review, this will highlight the background to computer science teaching in general, as well as approaches that can increase, but this will not suffice. You should rather than either cut, copy and paste from your proposal, or you should say, you should refer to your proposal specifically to where you've addressed the introduction, motivation and literature review. So this is incomplete, so I will refer the application back. Then the research questions, you will clearly look at the research questions to make sure that his data collection instruments actually aligns to this. So he's looking at interventions, and then he's looking at concepts of programming. So I'm now curious to see whether he's going to ask any demographic information. The question would be, does he really need demographic information? Because he didn't include anything in his objectives that he wants to compare maybe different racial groups in terms of how they are doing, do they have specific needs. So my sense would be there should be no request for demographic information. Okay, then the aims and objectives, it's not a well-stated aim. We don't have time to unpack this now, but it's very, very superficial for a PhD. Remember, a PhD, you have to actually contribute unique knowledge to the knowledge domain. So there should be your unique contribution, and I cannot see any unique contribution. This is looks like a master's study at this stage. Then he's saying he's going to use mixed methods, and he substantiates his choice, and I don't have an issue with that. The design is actually not well described as well. Maybe he did describe this in his proposal, but then he should refer the reviewer to the section in the proposal where this is actually discussed. Then the next section, so this now refers to the justice principle. So he is indicating that he's going to involve 3 groups of participants. It's going to be the students registered for this module at Unisa, then at this university, and then the lecturers in both universities. Okay, so he's saying that the population, and can you see now you need to do homework again. He's saying that within Unisa, the site population, there's a total of 1,200 Unisa students, and they are between this age and at this other university there are 30 to 40. And he's saying that at both universities there are only 3 lecturers. Okay, so let's say we believe that. So this is the population. I hope that he's not misinterpreting this as actually the sample size. But anyway, let's believe what he is saying. Then he's saying in terms of the sample size, he's saying that within the Unisa context, he will include all students are included. However, he's now saying only 80 to 100, so there's a bit of a mismatch there, because it would now mean that actually 1,200 should be included then in the sample, so that 1,200 should actually receive the questionnaire. Then all students in that university will be invited, and then all lecturers will be invited, and so according to him it's 3. Now the inclusion and exclusion criteria are often an issue. He's saying that they should be registered and they should be willing to participate in this study, and that I think would be acceptable. But if we have a look at the exclusion criteria, there are no exclusion criteria. Now colleagues, you have to think about exclusion criteria also. If you think about, there's 1,200 students maybe, but maybe 10 of them have a disability in terms of a visual, in terms of their let's say they may have a visual impairment. So immediately they are not going to be included in this study, because they will not be able to complete the survey because they're visually impaired. And there was no indication that if you are visually impaired, you cannot participate in the study. But who will now transform this survey so that visually impaired students can actually participate in the study? So can you see that visually impaired students are actually systematically excluded from this study? This brings us back to the justice principle. Is it just to exclude visually impaired students? Okay, I'm leaving you with that thought. So he's saying that the questionnaires will take 15 minutes and then the focus group will be 30 minutes. Now, colleagues, it's very seldom that you can do a focus group in depth that will only be 30 minutes. So again, I am just, this will not result in me referring the application back if it's only this issue, but I would rather advise the applicant to say that the focus group will last for 60 to 90 minutes, because this is also supported in literature. So then he's, let's quickly have a look at what he's saying about the contact details. He's saying that permission will be obtained from Unisa to use the email and cell phone details to which I already have access. So can you see he does have access to this information? He understands that he must ask Unisa, but at this stage he doesn't realize that Unisa, the RPSC, will only give him access to recruit participants either via email, and it will have to be my live email addresses, or through cell phone. They won't allow him both of these modes of access. So it's good if researchers can actually become aware of this. And then he's saying students will be invited to participate via My Life announcement and emails, and this will not suffice. So the committee must now already know only one mode of access will be provided by the RPSC, and they should understand this so that they can provide the necessary information to this researcher that wants to do the right thing but doesn't know the requirements. So I'm quickly going to skip this because we don't really have time. So let me rather skip this, and then I want quickly to look at the survey. So let's look at the survey. So there's the template document, and he used the template document. So this must always be on a Unisa letterhead, and he must remove this because I mean it's not. He must delete that section there, and then he did use template documents. So I presume that this letter will meet the necessary criteria. I am more concerned about the because this will definitely be anonymous. I'm more concerned about the focus group letter. We must have a look at the focus group letter. So let's quickly continue and go to the questions that he's asking. Okay, so I'm not very happy with his questions also. So I would be worried about the questions because it's not clear what can your university do to assist you more, to assist you in what. It's not well structured questions. These are methodological issues, but you want to make the life of the participants easier. So if I'm a reviewer, I would definitely comment on this as well. Then let me quickly go because I want to look at his informed consent. Let me just quickly see the informed consent document for the focus groups. Where is that document? Did he attach that? I think he attached it in this section. So I'm quickly going to go to the consent document. Okay, let's quickly have because now I want to see if he raised the risks to the participants. Okay, so let's see what is the purpose, why am I being invited? Okay, let's have a look at the risks. What are the potential benefits? Benefits for you relate to the exploration of approaches that can improve the teaching and learning of computer programming. Okay, I think he could have maybe expanded on this, but now look at this. Can you see there are actually no clear risks in this? The only inconvenience will be finding time to participate in a 30-minute online focus group. No risk or harmful side effects are expected, but that's not what he was saying in his application form. Even in the other informed consent document, we should have a look, because remember he said that there can be a risk that the participants might feel victimized. The students. So is that stated in that informed consent letter or not? So I would clearly not be happy with this. I would immediately refer it back. And we have 3 minutes left, but I just want to indicate also to you that he didn't understand, again, he didn't read this. It's clear that, you know, it's important that all of these should actually be yes, with the exception of those with an asterisk, you know. So if you look at it in your informed consent documents, the benefits must be shared, but he is saying no. I think he's just misinterpreting the two. The potential risk, the risk, he did indicate risk, but not completely. And this should have been, all of this should have been, he should have ticked yes there. I mean, it should be yes. He did include this statement that they can withdraw. Compensation or gifts, he should actually tick yes, because they're not going to receive compensation. I think he interpreted as he's not going to give them compensation. Reimbursement, this should be yes. Indemnity can be not applicable. This should all be yes. So how feedback, it is important to tell them how feedback will be provided, because he's saying they will benefit from it. So how will they be provided with feedback? And then can you see he doesn't he did say a confidentiality, that confidentiality cannot be guaranteed. Let's have a quick look at that. If confidentiality, did he say that? Your answers will be given a code number or other. No, he's saying this measure refers to confidentiality, is not indicating limits to confidentiality. No, he's not indicating limits to confidentiality. Okay, so that I may miss it now because I'm having a quick look, but this is an issue. So there must be limits to confidentiality, and focus groups are always critical. Colleagues, so I'm going to end here. I think we've went through the most important parts of the form. I think what is very important for you then is to go through this form. We've sent you this form as an example, and this is a form with a number of challenges in the form. I think it's sometimes very good also to have an example of a form that is actually, that has been completed maybe with less issues. And I will discuss with Tanya, if my office cannot, if you want that, we can maybe make an application available to you where there are less maybe issues, so that you can have a more complete form. But Tanya and my other colleague, Gamotso, can assist with this. Colleagues, so let's stop. It's 1 o'clock on the dot. When you go through the form, look at the questionnaire. Did he also ask for demographic information? And then, you already now know with Protection of Personal Information Act, the minimizing principle applies. So is it really necessary? He did ask for demographic information, and the Ethics Review Committee will question that. Why do you need the gender? You don't have a gender objective that you want to compare different genders. But I'm going to stop now.